rapidly over the past 15 years, and a lot of that is due to the hugely disseminated, widely overprescribed use of opioid painkillers, including but not limited to oxycodone, hydrocodone. Right? We can see that the increase of prescriptions for those, although tailing off again as laws have been passed, is largely thought to contribute heavily to this deadly epidemic that shows no signs of slowing down at present. Something else we know about this epidemic, about this problem, is that it is not hitting all parts of the country equally, and that there's actually pretty marked regional bias in terms of where the death rate is worse. So just to break this down quickly, all the green places have lower than average opioid overdose death rates in 2016. Dark blue, higher than average, light blue, about average. Interestingly enough, New York, although Long Island itself has been pretty hard hit, New York as a state is lower than average. But the place I'm going to be talking about, Woonsocket, which is in Rhode Island, is in one of the harder hit states of the country. And we can see broken down by big region. Some places have seen big leaps, Northeast and Midwest, formerly industrialized regions, formerly heavily unionized regions of the country are worse hit by this epidemic than other places, although it has grown across the country. Some other facts and figures about the opioid epidemic. It has not hit all racial groups equally. It started off especially hitting the white population worse, and some people have not inaccurately posed the question, well, why did the crack epidemic, which was largely, not exclusively, but largely a phenomenon of communities of color, why was that cracked down upon with this punitive vitriol, whereas suddenly we get this sort of disease narrative and rehabilitation narrative with a white population being hit by a similar epidemic now. And in terms of gender, it's also not an equal playing field. Men seem to be harder hit or more vulnerable to opioid addiction than women across the country. But class, as this association, this conference centrally deals with, is always a bit of a thorny subject, or at least an improperly or poorly defined subject when we get to these large-scale statistics. So we have to use proxies, or at least at present, based on income, based on education. And we can see here some evidence, though it's not terribly conclusive, that lower class, working class, perhaps, right, the further down you go in the economic spectrum, are hit a bit worse. Although it's growing for people, opioid addiction at both the top end and the bottom end of income, of zip code income spectrums. But we can also see here in terms of education, higher rates of addiction and death for groups lower in the education sphere. Now I want to shift gears and talk about something that maybe folks in the room are more familiar with, coming from backgrounds that study economics, sociology, and looking at trends in the U.S. Wealth spectrum, unionization, and so forth. These are some graphs we're probably very familiar with, right? Depressing as they are, right? The sudden surge and slow and ever more rapid decline of unionization in this country. It's pretty much bottomed out at what may be an all-time low in American history, at least since record-keeping has begun with regards to overall unionization. And we can see, connected with this, of course, the stagnation of incomes, right, separating off from the productivity increases that continue to pace, even accelerated of late, but incomes have remained stagnantly low for the vast majority of workers, goods-producing, non-managerial workers. And of course, the Keddy's curve, right, inequality going down in the mid-20th century, coming back up at the end, right? And here's a piece of work from an article myself and Laurel Lamonic that I presented 2 years ago here, where we take what I consider more rigorous Marxian definition of class, using these 4 groups and showing the evolution of median income across those groups. Shows something similar. Basically, the ruling class has experienced significant growth, and the working class has just sort of stagnated along here at the bottom, pretty much the same where it was in 1980 and 2010. So we see these overall indices of working class suffering, growing inequality, union decline. And the question I want to pose is, what might this have to do with the opioid epidemic? We see some hints, right? Obviously correlation is not causation, but there's no causation without some kind of correlation. There's no connection otherwise. We see some hints in a very generic aggregated form of the opioid and overdose death crisis rising apace with a decline in unionization. So if you're not convinced by that overall figure that there might be some kind of a connection, here's another one. This is a scatter chart of states plus DC, 51 cases. And the horizontal variable is the amount of union density decline from 1983 to 2016. So, for example, if a state had 23% density in 1983 and had 10% density in 2016, it would have been a 13-point decline. So that's what that's measuring over that time frame. The vertical axis is the opioid death rate per 100,000 people. Sorry, the overall overdose death rate, including all the drugs. So the majority of that is opioids, since it's the most likely to induce death in the single year 2016. And this is a significant correlation at the 0.017 level p-value, and there's a Pearson's correlation of 0.33. Right, so here's something that's perhaps a bit more rigorous, but still just correlation. But it leads us to the idea that perhaps there is a link between declining working class living standards, declining working class power, and diseases, or particularly addictions of despair, and resulting death. There's also a lot of people who fortunately don't die from their addictions, but still suffer for many years in other capacities additionally. So what I want to contribute today is first theorizing and then starting to flesh out some qualitative data that help us try to approach what that link might be like, what it might be about. I'm not presuming that there is one, right? But putting these pieces together. The first state that we know working class living standards have deteriorated since the 70s. And there's a pretty standard interpretation out there that, well, when times get tough, people will reach for drugs, reach for the bottle as sort of a solace, in many cases as a sort of alternative source of income if they're dealing and supplying to their friends, right, selling their prescription pills on the side, etc. Right? And that's not wrong, right? That's not inaccurate. I'm not disputing that account. But it fails to sort of get deeper below and address what the meaning and significance of drug use is, and especially addiction, especially opioid addiction, in its more pathological forms, right, for different social groups. So the key questions that I want to pose in an attempt to start to answer today are, why have large numbers of U.S. workers, or unemployed folks, uniquely among their advanced capitalist peers, and the international comparisons bear this out, become opioid addicted? What is the import of this phenomenon, this trend, right, which is wreaking havoc across many communities in this country? What is the import of this vis-a-vis collective action? And also about class-based political projects. Does it spell in some dystopic sense the end of the sort of final end of the Marxian project? Or is the working class destroying itself, or at least large sections of it? I personally don't advance that view, but it is something that we, at least those of us on the left, need to confront and at least deal with straight up. Marxist theory, of course, however, is one of the less developed sociological theories to dealing with drug abuse and use. Right? There are some hints at it coming out of the Birmingham School of Cultural Studies, right? Seeing drug use as a form of meaning making, even as a form of resistance to dominant bourgeois norms. And I think there's something in that explanation. And I think also the suggestive correlations that we saw before about union decline and the opioid death rate lead us to perhaps there being a reason to pursue such an explanation, to try and develop a Marxian or critical or conflict-oriented theory of addiction, rather than simply a deviance perspective or a purely subjectivist, sort of symbolic interactionist approach, although there may be much to support that. What I find is something similar to the main points advanced by Willis and others coming out of that 1970s Birmingham School about various working class symbols. Something similar to that, but there are elements of resistance in drug use, but it's a bit more complicated. What I find evidence of is that drug use and abuse in the particular community that I study is in some ways becoming a cultural replacement for productive work. Right? It's becoming a practice, a habit that is so pervasive in the lives and social activities of many people in this community that was once marked by strenuous, repetitive factory labor. And that abstinence or recovery from addiction is in itself a displaced form of resistance. Instead of resisting capital, many post-industrial workers in the community that I studied are resisting addiction in collective and individualized forms and dedicating immense moral energy to this task that is in many cases insurmountable, but also does have examples of success. So, where's the place that I studied? Small town, it's not that small, small city I should say, called Woonsocket, Rhode Island, right in the northern corner of this very small state. In a state itself that is overall hard hit by the opioid crisis, and a county that is particularly hard hit. It once it was a former textile mill town. It had a big heyday of labor organizing in the 1930s and 40s, documented in the book that I'll talk about in a second. Has lower than average labor force participation, higher than average poverty, lower than average income, although its ethnic breakdown is somewhat approximate to the national average, not completely, but borders on that. And a high rate of people on, higher than average rate of people on social benefits, SNAP, cash assistance, etc. What I'm primarily basing my findings off of are 60 in-depth interviews that I've conducted with residents over the past 3 years. A little bit more background. It's the town in its heyday. Uniquely, it was at one point 80+% French Canadian. That was a particular group that was brought in to staff the mills in the late 19th, early 20th century. Its heyday of labor organizing was documented in a sort of well-known labor history by Gary Gerstel. It covers the period up to about 1960. And was marked by, more detail I can go into this about, but was marked by a sort of very, very militant and actually with a very broad social democratic vision that was advanced by a couple of Franco-Belgian socialists who helped lead the organization of this particular industrial union in that town that enjoyed significant success until the mills did close in the early 1950s, rapidly. And today, it's got problems. Right? It's one of many mill fires that occurred in the past decade. It was the subject of a documentary called Lost in Woonsocket about two alcoholics, one of whom recovers, one of whom doesn't, that is now used widely in recovery groups across the country. And as you walk down Main Street, you see a lot of buildings that are empty, unoccupied, sort of a shell of its former self. Just to give you a sense of what it's like today. So what I'm going to argue is three things. I'll go over them and I'll come back to them more detail. First, that work itself has become more precarious, more varied, more undependable. It's not a sustainable site of effort expenditure and meaning formation, identity formation for many of the people, for the vast majority of the people that I interviewed. Two, that in its place, over more than one generation, has arisen practices of substance use and abuse. Heavy endemic substance use, either in the participants' lives themselves, they themselves have been addicts or are currently addicted, or use substances regularly as part of their daily routines, or of those around them, of their family members. That substance use in many ways has become to be a cultural replacement for wage work. And last but not least, that abstinence and recovery are themselves a new displaced form of struggle that is more immediate, more palpable to many working class people who are on the margins of employment than resisting capital, than resisting employers. Although that may be necessary in the end is in forming a broader movement to fight back against the depredations of large-scale capital and the lack of social investment, even to stop the addiction epidemic itself. That seems very distant to a lot of them, and they focus a lot of their moral energies on the recovery process. So to give a little more depth on each of those, I'll just provide some illustrative quotes from some of the interviews that I conducted. Won't read through them all, but it's a bit much. But just some examples of work becoming a shifting, precarious, episodic occurrence, which is in great contrast to the sort of full-time factory labor that once defined this particular place. So Dan is semi-employed. I don't have much of a work history, just bouncing from one job to another. It's not easy. It's a new digital age with the resumes. Everything's all computer-based instead of applications. Nowadays, there's a lot of people who are working for less, especially people that don't have a college education, like himself. Kathy, who herself is a recovering addict, suffered a severe car accident, was receiving disability at the time we spoke. Talked about her first job being in Walmart. Was then a manager, assistant manager. Worked at Record Town. Now it's FYE. Same thing at Walden Books, Fannie Farmer Candy, San Francisco Music Box. All the places I used to work no longer exist. Just cycling through different jobs, different places that have very little stability. And April, young single mom, mid-20s, talking about dropping out in 9th grade. I've done all kinds of small tedious jobs like babysitting, retail, customer service. That pretty much sums it up. That's my life. Most of it has always been short-term. My last job was at the Dollar Tree. I ended up leaving that because my son came down with ADHD and had to pick him up from school. Her partner, father of the son, also suffered from severe medical issues and was unable to work. So she essentially double caregiver in her mid-20s. Just some examples, but these patterns were repeated again and again throughout all 16 interviews. In place of, how do I know the time?
You're 4 minutes.
Just
Nice try.
No, it's
Yeah,
only
right.
been 4 minutes.
well, that's good. All right. So, obviously, this is not. I cannot yet claim. I'm not trying to claim that this is a definitive pattern that is pervasive across all post-industrial communities, etc. But these are the patterns that are starting to bubble up from the research that I've done so far, and that what is a palpable, immediate daily practice in the lives of pretty much everybody that I interviewed in this town is substance use and abuse in one form or another. Is one of the most salient daily practices in respondents' narratives, whether their own or those around. And I believe that this is indicative of a cultural activity that is itself more imminent, more reliable as a site for effort expenditure for social activity, for engaging, and also for generating income in many capacities than wage work itself, or as a strong complement to that. So, for example, talking to Kia, who was in her early 30s, a sales manager, I asked her, I said, well, what's your life history? So my life history? I took the easy way. It's what everybody does out here. Sell drugs. Sold drugs and had kids. Finally, I got a job. It's pretty much juggling daycare, the job, the government here, the welfare office there. They don't help you enough because if you make $8 an hour, 25 hours a week, they say you make too much. You get cut off from benefits. Teresa, herself a recovering addict in the mid-40s, saying that heroin helps me do what I've got to do. It gets me through the day. It makes me like what cocaine did for people in the 80s. If I could afford it, I would still be doing it. He was on methadone at the time. Ethan, a young bartender who himself was not a user, described that being a young kid, himself was in his mid-20s, but still saw himself that way, despite having 2 kids and a full-time job. Being a young kid trying to make it on your own now sucks, especially in Rhode Island. Woonsocket, where he now lives, is more drug-infested than Cranston, the place where he came from, a town about a half hour south. Everybody I see here is doing heroin with that fake weed, the monkey. And last but not least, Kevin, a former convict, out of jail now, meatpacker, in his late 20s, talking about a few of his friends who passed away this year because of the dope. Everybody's doing it. Everybody. It's the culture. And the last point I want to make is just sort of reinforcing this, what I see as another pattern of recovery itself being a prime site and abstinence for those who have not formally been addicted, as a huge source of moral engagement for a lot of working class people and people who are in the margins of employment or unemployed in this town. In many ways, it becomes a more palpable source for their energies, for their than in previous decades, resisting capital, resisting employers through mass strikes, through picketing, through collective action. Not that it couldn't be combined with that at the same time, not that it precludes that as an opportunity, but in some ways it's a more immediate task that a lot of these folks undertake. So Artie, for example, unemployed carpenter in his late 40s, and I also interviewed his brother, talked about coming from a drug addict family, right, moving around a lot, but he insisted that despite he does drugs and drinks a lot, said, I'm not a heroin head, I'm not a fucking junkie. Corinne, a young woman whose parents were both junkies, they were good parents, stated that addiction gets annoying. I don't want to be like that. I don't want to ruin my life. She was currently in a job training and in the social services network of a local nonprofit that was helping her sort of put her life back together after suffering homelessness, abuse, etc. Cammie, someone who would actually sort of turn the bend a bit, talked about finally surrendering and going into rehab in November 2015. It changed my life in a really big way because she was able to stay clean. That's something I love about Woonsocket. They have the system going on, and people support each other and look out for each other. And Gabriel, a young man in his early 30s, said, I'm in recovery because I was abusing alcohol and drugs and I wanted to get away from that lifestyle. It's sad to see people going through it, so I can see myself in the community like Woonsocket once I'm on my feet. I can see myself maybe trying to help people. So I'll pretty much leave it at that. There's more to be spelled out there, lessons for the left, and sort of 3 points I'm trying to make here. And some other examples that we can sort of try and stretch this to and understand. Perhaps the West Virginia teacher strike. West Virginia was the hardest hit by far state of the opioid epidemic in 2016. Yet, early this year had one of the most militant successful labor actions in many years. It sparked a wave of similar actions across the country. So there's definitely some lessons to be drawn out there, but I'll perhaps leave that to the discussion. Thanks, folks. Thank folks for the time.
Okay, I'm going to have a slideshow. shift in the schedule now. So next we're going to have Tim Strangleman from the University of Kent, professor of sociology and past president of this organization. So perhaps many of you know him. He'll be presenting a paper, Emotion, Embeddedness, and Disembedding Class in the Contemporary Workplace.
Hi everyone. This works really well. Originally I was going to be on a panel with two of my graduate students, but it works really well. I'm talking to many of the same issues. I have to say I'm not a quantitative sociologist, so no statistics were harmed in making of this presentation. So I guess what I'm trying to do is look at what has just been said, but trying to think about it both conceptually but also through my work through my career. And I was very conscious that one of the quotes I'm going to put up I showed last year, and I'm kind of like a dog with a bone. I'm trying to work it through because I'm trying to work out what all this means, and I'm not sure I've got the answers, but I think it fits. And really what I'm talking about is a change in working class culture, how working class culture, the kind of jobs people do, without romanticising them, used to provide the kind of shoulder-to-shoulder sense of community, which has been evacuated, and perhaps other things are going in their place. And I'm trying to get echoes of it in my work, pieces of work I've used in my work. They're disparate, they're from different people, different men and women, but I'm trying to get a sort of temper of what that culture is like, and what it means through the breaking down, trying to get echoes of it. So I want to kind of place this embedded culture and also think about the disembedding, trying to conceptualise attachment and loss in working class communities and working class jobs. I'll give you some illustrations, some quotes, and no statistics, don't worry. And there are some pictures, but only a few. And then think about what it means. I'm editing the handbook of working class studies with Michelle and Christy, and these are very pertinent questions for us at the moment, particularly around where next for the working class, because next 2 years' time will be 25 years really of working class studies, and I guess working class studies comes out of a concern with the breakdown of a traditional Fordist working class, in part. And it's interesting to see how through working class studies this is kind of the concerns we have developed, and people are thinking through ideas. So, okay, really simplistic. I'm going to be a sociologist here. Juxtaposing the old economy, the new economy. The old economy, embedded, Fordist, standardised, industrialised, stability, especially during the long-term post-war period, the glorious 30, slightly later in Europe because of the war, but US the same, and it's scary how it's the same sort of period from the late 40s through to 73, 75. And in many ways we're still living in the fallout from the ending of the long boom, and this perspective is giving us sort of pause for thought. And of course during that period you've got, it's not just a class, it's an emergent class culture, maturing class culture. E.B. Thompson talked about making an English working class, an emergent working class in the UK, or England specifically, from 1930 onward. And you think, well, that class, that industrial culture carries on being formed, changing with region, locality, with different identities. The new economy, on the other hand, is portrayed in a very, very different way. All the stability, all that old idea of permanence suddenly gets lost, and some of that is often overstated, but with the passage of time it starts to look more like some of the ideas that were proclaimed in the 1980s, 1990s and the 2000s. So rather than embedding, perhaps we're disembedded, and I'll talk more about those terms in a second. Work is fragmented. People talk about, in the last session, we were talking about the gig economy, the platform economy. Work is insecure or insecure. And then what is this class culture that emerges from this precariat? Is almost kind of the anti-working class. And I think what's been interesting over my career is the kind of books I've used, drawn on in my work, but also I teach, has kind of shifted. So oftentimes the management, I'm always wary that some garage door's going to fly open somewhere in Long Island, but who knows? Charles Handy, the Empty Raincoat, this is basically, I forget when this was, I think it was mid to early 80s even, a book about the way people were changing jobs and the idea that they weren't kind of fully embedded and embodied with the work. And then the turn of the millennium, Richard Sennett's book, Crows No Character, which is problematic in lots of ways. He doesn't trouble himself with statistics much. It's quite handy to sit next to the son of the person you interviewed in the 1970s and then talk about the differences in generations. Who am I to criticise Richard Sennett? But nonetheless, he captures the zeitgeist, I think, of the early, mid, late 90s, of this sense of the lack of embeddedness people have. And he's talking about, I guess, professional middle class people who are moving from one job to another, and cites at the time graduates, US graduates, moving perhaps 15 to 18 jobs during their career. And then coming into and so I've talked about in my work a kind of wave of books in the mid to late 90s that kind of heralded the end of work idea. What you then get is a kind of second wave. Now, statistically, the end of work is kind of knocked back. He's said, well, job tenure is actually marginally going up, so you can't talk about this. Then there's a second wave, I think, of end of work proclamation in people like Carrie Lane, who talks about software engineers in Texas, talks about the way in which when they're made redundant or laid off in the US parlance, what happens is they don't blame their employer, they don't blame the economy, they don't blame government. They look to themselves and their own resources, their own networks to get the next job. So it's a highly individualised thesis, so it comes out of the individualisation thesis. And then Guy Standing's work, the new precariat, talks about a new class structure, an emerging group of people at the bottom of the labour market who are united only by the fact that they don't have good jobs, prospects, pensions, good conditions, or the ability to improve through work. Again, controversial, but again, hits the zeitgeist. So all sorts of ideas of precarity. And then David Will, who became one of Obama's Labour advisors, this fantastic book, The Fissured Workplace, who trying to provide a taxonomy of the different ways in which work is being fragmented, and as he says, fissures, and it's a great idea. So through the work I've done over the years, I've been trying to conceptualise this idea of stability versus precarity, instability. And the book I'm kind of finishing off at the moment, and the stuff I've written about deindustrialisation, draws on a couple of Anya's work at Frederick, Great Transformation, and particularly this idea of embedding and disembedding. And basically what he's talking about is the early days of industrial society. Work is disembedded and then becomes re-embedded through structures of regulation. And in many ways, what we've seen over the past 30 years, if not longer, is a kind of disembedding of work and labour. But also, especially early in my career, I talked about this idea of greening and brownfield sites, particularly through management culture change programs, which were very prevalent, I know, in the US, but particularly I looked at them in the UK context, where what seemed to be happening was a deliberate attempt to break up workplace culture. Workplace culture seen as conservative, hidebound, bureaucratised, and getting in the way of change and swift movement. But what inadvertently was happening is it was ripping out the unstated, unacknowledged ways in which workers embedded themselves in work. It was a kind of deliberate attempt to pull people out. And then finally to think about this in terms of metaphors of fragmentation, some of which go back to the previous slide. I did all these kind of metaphors of fissuring, corrosion, flux, precarity. Zygmunt Bauman talks endlessly about liquidity and this end of work. So we're dealing with a kind of whole series of ways of thinking about instability versus stability. So just some illustrations, and they're taken from lots of different projects I've done and readings of other work. And this is Kate Dudley's work, End of the Line, from about 1996. And I use it all the time for lots of different things. She's talking about an unemployed assembler from a car line. And so Donna is quoted as saying, the plant's closed, and she said, when they start tearing down the plant, I'm going to get a brick. I'll just keep it. My kids know Mum spent 15 years of her life in the plant working. And to tell my future grandkids about it, tell them that there was a place where we worked, and when they tore down the building, Grandma went and got herself a brick. Although I put in there, at least I deserve a brick. Now, I've written a lot about this and what it says about materiality. So she's getting herself a brick, which in Marxist terms, she's actually getting a reminder of, supposing, her alienation. But what I think she's also talking about is a reminder of the culture she was once embedded in and how important it was to her. From my own work on the railways, this is from an autobiography of a signal worker, and he's recounting being a young lad. He's doing the job I used to do as a train recorder. So he's just started on the job. And he said, by my 8th day, that hitherto impenetrable barrier had been conquered, and Ted Cox, this is his signalman, so this is kind of superior, the guy he's teaching him. Ted Cox's face broke down to a satisfied smile. Up until then, he's been an awful guy to me. With a pat on the back, he announced, you'll make it loud. Now we'll show you how to write. Your script is appalling. Up until then, I'd secretly feared him. Now I felt a conversion to almost hero worship. And what I think I overuse this quote as well, because I think it shows in a really short passage just how people kind of embed themselves in work, and they're embedded. He hated this guy in the earlier passage, he hated this guy. All of a sudden, he gets what he's gone through. He's now embedded in a culture, he's now part of it, but he's been kind of tested to it. So what I'm trying to get is intimations to this culture. This is an interview I did with a National Union of Mine Worker official in Durham. Oh my God, 20 years ago. So he's talking, incredibly articulate. Put it better than most sociologists, I think, can. So he's talking about what the mine industry gave people. And he's talking about culture and community. And he said, young people entering the mining industry were very, very quickly brought into an atmosphere of self-discipline. Because when you got underground, you had to have very good discipline. You might have had 3 generations of people working in the mine, and the elderly generation was always very well respected. And that discipline and respect for your elders was immediately fostered onto you. So you got people growing up with respect for elderly people. The mining industry itself formed part of the discipline that's required in society in general. And it's interesting, he said, I'm not talking about discipline in the sense where you brutalise people, anything like that. It's a condition of mind. It's how you condition people's mind. It's the way in which they should be conducting themselves, not only in their work, but society in general. He's captured beautifully that sense of work spills into community, community spills into work. He's talking about the family reproduced underground and then reproduced at the top and ahead. He then is going on to compare and contrast the breakdown of community in the mining areas in County Durham in the 80s and 90s. And then this is the quote I talked about last year. This is from my work on Guinness. This was really interesting. This was a Guinness worker who was about to be made redundant, so he's being interviewed about 6 months before he's redundant. And he's talking about his kids. Now, he's been a manual worker in the brewery for nearly 40 years, and he's talking about his kids, his boys that have gone on and been successful, gone to college, become engineers. and he said, talking about one of his sons, he said his experience, I suppose, is the same as mine. But he did 11 years at Nestle, and they've been going through doing basically he's comparing what's happening to his son in Nestle much earlier in his son's career, what's going on in Guinness. So he was made redundant in February this year. We talked about it a fair bit because Nestle, again, even then, there was a culture. You joined a company, it's not quite you stayed forever, but you were in that and that was it. His other son, by contrast, goes to college, gets educated, gets a degree, becomes an engineer, but then moves from one job to another, spends a year, 18 months, and flits about. And the guy that I was talking to, Dave, was kind of condemning a bit of his son, because he's saying, you've got to stick with it, you've got to make a career for yourself. His one son does that, gets made redundant. His next son flips about and has inadvertently made himself more employable because he's got more experience. And then it's almost an existential crisis that Dave, the Guinness worker's got, because he's in the process of being made redundant, and kind of it's an opportunity and an affordance to reflect on the kind of career he's had. And he's saying, should I have stayed? Was that a good move? So his value, his commitment, his embeddedness is something he's now thinking, well, what was that about? Was that as good as it got? Or should I have moved around? And what were the stories, what were the narratives I was telling my kids? What's the use of, how as a father can I tell my kids what to do when my advice is actually wrong? My son that I was condemning, kind of. So he says, so yeah, I've had quite long conversations with them. But one of the things I've tried to encourage them is not quite get stuck in the groove. Robert has been forced to think about that because he was made redundant from Nestle. With Stephen, his other son, it's the other thing. I wish you would stay a little longer with each company. But yes, we talked about work, we talked about redundancy. So he then goes on to say he wished Stephen would stay a little longer, but then he says something like, well, perhaps he was right not to. So just to wrap up, and I think going back to the previous paper, there's some questions here for class, and I think it is a gendered narrative, but as we saw with Donna's quote then, I think actually there's a lot of similarities between men and women in the way they embed themselves, especially in industrial work. And the question for me, which I don't pretend to have the answers to, is how is the kind of embedding we have seen in the past possible or viable in the present and future? The kind of work that most young people see now is not what older generations would have seen, for better or worse. What does that mean for working class culture and working class life? The kind of quotes you saw there about someone getting a brick because they wanted to remember, is that going to be true of an Uber driver? Are they going to, a delivery driver? Can that work be portrayed as heroic or meaningful in the same way? Or will we be decrying that in future years? And what does it mean for working class studies? It really strikes me that if, and we don't do this, but if we're stuck in just looking back at work back in the day, that's not viable for working class studies. We need to know and understand how people are making sense of embeddedness now and the kind of ways they might be resisting a lack of embeddedness. So this is a shameless plug for my book. Isn't it beautiful? It's a long time coming, but thanks for listening.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, we have Megan Osborn, a community organizer and a graduate student from Virginia Commonwealth University. And she's going to be giving a paper Biography Different Worlds, How Cultural Disconnect, Biases, and Miscommunications Create and Maintain Class Barriers in Community
So, in my work, I do more conversational narrative work, and I think there's a certain differential power dynamic in standing in front of a class and teaching you things. So I'm more going to be talking to you, like, instead of me being a teacher, just
over here.
someone that's sharing my experience with you. How do I?
If you press F5 should do it.
Okay. So I'm from WCSA in Virginia, and that's in Richmond. And this map is very important because our poverty level at this point, poverty rate is around 25%. Population is 223,000. Richmond metro area is 1.2 million. We were the capital of the Confederacy, and our major trades were in slavery and tobacco. Our current population is about 49% black, 39% white, 6% Hispanic, 2% Asian, and about 3% mixed race. And specifically, for people without health care that are under 65 years old, there's about 18% of our residents, and about 13% are people with a disability under 65 years old. And what I'm going to be talking about today is a project that I did because I am a Master of Sociology student. And I wanted to learn participatory action research hands-on. So I went and searched for anyone affiliated with the university or in the community that had done a participatory action research project anytime in the near past. And I found someone at the medical college that is associated with VCU. And she said that she suggested I go to this coalition meeting. And it was a coalition of over 40 service providers and healthcare organizations that service Northside Richmond. So here's Northside. And as you can see, it's a huge part of it right here is the most impoverished area of Richmond. And she said, go there and see if you come out of there with any ideas. So I went, and the first thing that they said when I was there, and as she said, I come from a working class background. So I came here, although I am in academia and have been in academia for a while, I am still often baffled at middle class norms and interactions, especially when it comes to healthcare and understanding the disenfranchised and things like that. So one of the first things that they said that their goals of existing were to have data-driven action and decision-making, to have resident engagement and meaningful strategic conversations, and to ask themselves what are the needs and gaps of the community and how to get them better involved, specifically in Northside Strong meetings. And they left with the following questions, and I quote, where are the community members? Because there were none there. Why are they not present at Northside Strong meetings? Why is the community not engaging with Northside Strong partners? And I really wanted to raise my hand and give them a whole slew of answers. But I thought, why not make this trying to answer their questions while also trying to find out more information on the personal viewpoints of employees that work in these service providing organizations, as well as residents in the communities, where they think there might be a miscommunication or maybe biases that they have that kind of hinder them from interacting well or at all, or misrepresentations, or just whatever. I kind of went in there with an open idea, and as I was sitting down making the survey questions, I would often add more questions on, because it was a really kind of open-ended. All of the questions that I asked when I sat down with these people were open-ended questions. But I wanted the conversation to kind of meander to wherever the participant wanted to go, and that they felt was important to what I was asking. But I also wanted to ask certain things, so I did that. So what I did was I recruited participants through referrals, through snowball sampling. So I started with people that worked at these organizations. I would get maybe like 1 or 2 people, and then they would say, oh, you should talk to this person, oh, you should talk to this person. And there were so many organizations that wanted to talk to me that I didn't have enough time to, which was really actually cool. My mentor told me that that's pretty rare. So I did 7 in-person interviews and 3 self-administered surveys. So I interviewed 10 representatives from 9 partner organizations, and those interviews ranged from about an hour and a half to 2 hours each. I mainly asked them what type of work or services that they provide in Northside to the residents, how they connect with the residents, their level of community engagement interest, their thoughts on barriers in communication and engagement between service providers and residents, and how they brainstorm as an organization to fill in these gaps. So what I found is that the people that I talked to, I asked how long they had been with the organization themselves. And this is very important when compared to how long residents have lived there. So the median was 20 months that they've been with the organization. And the length of time that the organization itself had existed was a median of about 10 years. So 100% of these community organizers were interested in community engagement, but only 60% wished to provide services. And it was my understanding, and especially through the presentations that were given at Northside Strong meetings, that that's what they were there for, to provide services to residents. So that kind of confused me. 90% of them believed that it was important to involve residents in their healthcare and community well-being. Again, I was confused about why that wasn't 100%. 90% believed it's important for residents to be able to define their own needs. Again, that should be 100% to me, but it wasn't. And 100% believe it's important for residents' concerns to be heard by healthcare leaders and professionals. And 100% as well believe that there are barriers in communication or engagement between service providers and residents. So that's where I started to ask, so all of you see that there are barriers. What are these barriers? What have they looked like in your experience, and how do you think your organization and you personally can overcome them? And And they said that they have a need for authentic and frank conversations with residents about their needs. And they need to have more rapport building and gain more trust to get buy-in to the current services that they provide. They said that there are some gaps in communication and outreach will change with time, since the healthcare paradigm is now changing to social determinants of health. And many wish to do more hands-on, face-to-face work with residents, but they just don't have time. So next I went on to interview residents, and this was the most exciting part for me because I come from a working class background and I'm currently disabled and have been for years. And so I guess you would say I am now part of the poverty class, even though I'm in graduate school. So although I am white, I connected with a lot of these people on that level, and it was really heartwarming, and a lot of the things that they said kind of upset me about their interactions with healthcare providers, but I'll share some of those with you. I had so many residents contacting me. I still have residents contacting me, and this project ended over a year ago. That really tells me that they want their voices to be heard, they want to tell their stories, and that they have concerns that they want to identify to others so that they can get them addressed. And a lot of the people that I interviewed found this as a way to empower themselves, to start using their voice. So I interviewed 12 people, residents. So I started out with questions to try to find out what kind of resources that residents have in their communities, whether it's they're interacting with their neighbors or community events or whatever. Because it seemed like when I talked to the service providers that they thought that they were kind of coming in knowing what's best for the residents. Here are some services, use our services because we know what's best for you, and then okay, thanks, now we're gonna leave. And they never really got to know the residents very well. They never sat down to talk at length with residents. They never really were asking people, what kind of services would you like? What would help you? What would help us help you? Nothing like that, no conversations like that were occurring. So, knowing that these healthcare organizations were saying that these residents are not utilizing our services to the level we expect, there's obviously an alternative way that they're meeting their needs, whatever their needs may be. So I asked about person-to-person connections that residents had in their neighborhood. Almost all of the residents knew their neighbors. Although most don't have family members that lived in their neighborhood, they do have friends that live in their neighborhood, and they would often support one another either by like having community cookouts or offering to go grocery shopping for the elderly woman down the street, or cutting their neighbor's grass or various things like that. Watching a neighbor's kid while they're at work. And interestingly enough, 100% of the residents I interviewed had access to health care. And that was in strict, like, I don't know how to emphasize this enough. The healthcare providers thought that these people do not have access to healthcare at all. They're just like, how do we bring healthcare to these people? 100% had access to healthcare. What the issue was that also all of them got healthcare outside of their neighborhoods, and transportation was often an issue. But most of them said that they did have a regular doctor that they went to for healthcare. 66% of people felt comfortable talking to their doctors, and the ones that didn't felt that the environment became difficult or hostile when the discussion of drug use came up. 100% of the people said that they take their health seriously and feel that the role that they play in their own healthcare is important to them. In the residents that struggled with drug use, that role was difficult to stick with during active addiction, but during recovery, they felt that that was something that was really important to them. Most residents preferred to learn about health topics from sources other than their doctors. So 88% of people prefer to use the internet. Other sources were books, television or medical news, the library, and doctors. So I asked several questions, and I'll summarize these because I don't have a lot more time, but I asked several questions about informal community engagement and what that looked like to them. And they said that most of them felt that it's important to be actively involved in the well-being of the community, and also almost the same amount were very active in the community, with some stating that they're somewhat active. Most said that they would like to be more active in the community. And when asked what would help them become more active, they said they had a need for childcare, kids' activities, timing of events around resident schedules, better health, financial ability to be involved, and availability of more activities. Also, some people talked in depth about how either mental health or justice system involvement keeps people, or can keep people, from being involved either in community events or in more structured environments, such as going regularly to see a doctor, or seeking out social services, or thinking that perhaps if they have a warrant out for their arrest, if they're going to seek services from one of the service organizations, that they might be arrested or reported to the police or something, which was not true, but they did not know that. So one formal institution that people really identified with was church, but again, most of the people attended church outside of the community. It was really strange because the churches that were in Northside also had people that came from outside Northside to go to church and then leave. So it was kind of a docking place to service organizations, church, do your thing and then go. But then what happens to the people that live there all the time? They don't really have anything available to them right next door. Let's see. So how residents reach out for support, they said that they most people have someone they can ask for help if they're experiencing a health crisis, and they did not cite a doctor when they said that. They usually cited a family member or neighbor. And they said they would prefer that instead of emergency services such as calling 911, going to a hospital, or calling their doctors. They also said the same thing about another type of crisis, such as perhaps there's someone breaking into your neighbor's house. They would prefer to call a neighbor or a family or a friend instead of police. So what I found in summing up is that there was a large disconnect between the service providers and the residents. Service providers thought that they knew what was best for the residents, and that the residents were not having their needs met at all. And they were baffled about basically how they could exist, if I'm to be frank. When I talked to the residents, they were confused about how these service organizations didn't understand that they had this informal network of family, friends, and neighbors that they could and often did reach out to for help in any situation, really. And that they would really like to be more involved in things like this coalition, because I asked them specifically after I explained to them what the coalition was, if they would like to be involved. And I think everyone but one person said yes, and that one person said they had too many things that they're doing already. But they said they would be more likely to be involved if they're listened to. And it's not just numbers being spewed at them, and charts and graphs and jargon, that there are narratives, that stories are being told, that their stories are heard and listened to, and that they're taken seriously. Instead of trying to get buy-in, as the organizations wanted, they really do need to sit down and just listen to the residents. And that's kind of what I wanted to tell them in the first meeting that I went to, but I did all of this and then I presented it to them. And they were like, okay, yay, data. Yeah, so, thank you.
So thank you all very much. We have about 20 minutes now for the conversation, so go for it.
Thank you. These are great, great papers, great programs, and all three of them. Thank you. Thank you for presenting them. I found them really provocative. I have a couple of dozen questions, but I'll just limit it to one from me for Peter, if I may, sort of a double-edged question. If you believe, and I think it makes sense, that alienation and exploitation are causes of the opioid factors and factors, significant factors, if you think that's true, how would you measure them in research? How would you measure alienation and exploitation? And would levels of anxiety and depression maybe be markers for that? I don't know how you do it, but would they be? Could they be? Because you need some measuring. And the other part of it is your description of the people in this community who have precarious work, no work, marginal work, and turn to alcohol and drugs, remind me of Marx's concept of the lumpen proletariat. And I wonder if you think that his work on that would be useful in looking at the opioid addiction today.
We're doing straight Q&A?
Just go for it, yeah.
I hope I didn't put you on the spot.
No, that's fine. Great questions. Your first question was related to
Measuring alienation and exploitation, if we want to measure this correlation.
Yeah, so all right, so what I mean by alienation is essentially power imbalance, power difference, being excluded from a process of which you're ultimately a part of, not being able to make decisions over it, not having a decision-making capacity for the actions that affect your life.
So, for example, a lack of a union, or in a similar organization?
Yeah, well, you can be alienated and still be unionized. I mean, like, you know, so I wouldn't necessarily equate the two. If you're unionized and you're not alienated, there's plenty of auto workers who are highly unionized and still hate their job because they have no power over decisions in the day-to-day basis. So when you talk about measuring alienation, I mean, it's pretty. The vast majority of people I have interviewed with one exception are have very little power over their day-to-day lives. They have very little power. Well, many of them lack transportation. They lack the means to get transportation. They've lost that for. They lack the means to get it. Just so it becomes this vicious cycle of not being able to get a job because you don't have a car. You can't get a car because you don't have a job, and then you turn to what's around you, and it's also we also have to think it's not just an individual making a choice on a day-to-day basis. It's a whole multi-generational spectrum of many cases of abuse, substance abuse, and being endemic in this environment. Some people are new to, some people have been in for a while. So, in the sort of quantitative, positivistic measuring sense, as if I was to field a survey, I've done that kind of research too. I mean, I know how to draft a survey questionnaire and think what my indicators are going to be, and what scale of alienation they're going to have. I'm not exactly sure how that would be applicable to a historical, qualitatively informed product such as this. So, I'm not sure how I would measure that. I've done that in other cases. And then you had a second question, which was
Does Marx's notion of the one component, does that fit, or does that shed any light on the people in this town?
It's certainly a valid comparison. Marx has taken some heat afterwards for sort of equating people who are down and out and suffering from various elements of social pathology to lump into the proletariat, this reactionary reservoir in society. And I think some of his writing and things like that were not terribly developed at the time. So while I think in one is a necessary sort of stepping off point, because I'm using Marx's theory, I'm using a version of it, in attempting to explain the connection between, explain the phenomenon of opioid addiction, I would find that the concept of the lump proletariat itself more stigmatizing than limiting than eliminating in this case.
Thanks.
I don't know who was first. So
Go ahead.
one and then the next.
I think the concept that I want to talk about might be applicable to all three presentations, but specifically the questions for 10, it's not a statistics question. So
Thank God.
yeah. I'm not super familiar, core area is not this concept of embeddedness at work. And I found myself wondering, some of it seems to be describing attachment to like making your job part of your identity, right? And then so then I was wondering, since which work is part of your individual identity, and you take on the identity of the corporation you're working for, the sort of branding, right? And maybe in this disparate or place we're less connected to a specific corporation or specific institution. But that's what I was picking up on, but I wonder if what could be embedded instead is solidarity or like connection to fellow workers rather than connection to the specific institution that we're working in. And so that's the concept that I was thinking about, was the idea of solidarity, right? Like maybe ex-addicts who are trying to work through these processes that you're describing. There's like a solidarity in working together and their individual struggles there. And maybe part of what's happening, part of this dichotomy is, it was easy in some ways, not ever easy, I guess, but there's mechanisms for solidarity when everyone's on the shop floor or everyone's down the line together, right? But when I think it's a lot more difficult to create solidarity in a place where everyone's working on shifts at like a fast food restaurant, or even harder when everyone's driving an Uber independently, right? Or working with a TaskRabbit or something like that. And so I just wonder if we can bring solidarity into the conversation on all of these. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I wasn't necessarily saying that solidarity is through the corporation. I think people within corporations produce solidarity often in opposition to their management or their corporation. Sometimes the Guinness book I'm writing, that was kind of aided by a very benign paternalistic employer.
Right.
But it was something over and above that people did. But oftentimes it was something in opposition to. And this is why I think we need more studies of what's going on in the workplace now, and more kind of qualitative understandings of what's going on. Because as you're saying about TaskRabbit and Uber drivers, we have Deliveroo in the UK. I don't know if it's basically Uber for delivering fast food.
Yeah.
And in my in my town, where University of Kent is, which everyone's welcome to next September, for the September 12 months, plug there for the conference. The Deliveroo drivers, when they're not delivering in their downtime, it's amazing. You can see 12, 15, 20 sometimes waiting for their next job, all because they haven't got a kind of place to go. They congregate in a place where I guess it's partly social, but it's partly also in numbers. They just talk, and I can't believe they're not talking about their work. They're all visibly in this uniform, this kind of strange type of blue uniform with huge boxes on their backs, and they're repairing their bikes and they're talking. So I think it depends what job part of the gig economy you're in, that they might well be, I think, and then I think new social media might well be something that helps in that. So I think the kind of solidarities might emerge, but may not. But the terrain on which they'll emerge will be different, or they might not emerge at all. But of course, it's easier when they're in factories or in big work.
More structural impediments to it now.
Yeah.
Because those are disparate, but
I have a personal anecdote about that, actually. I was an order-up driver before they became Grubhub, and there's a lot of order-up drivers in Richmond, and we would all meet at this one place downtown and just stand around and talk about stuff until our next order came up. And a lot of the things that we talked about had nothing to do with our work, but we also talked about our work and how much we got on this tip or how annoying this customer was or whatever. But aside from the face-to-face contact, we also had a Facebook group where we would just go on there and talk about the same thing, but not in person, which new social media does, at least in that instance, involve that. So yeah, that was interesting.
I wonder to what extent folks like Uber drivers know the other Uber drivers in the same city with them, right? I don't even know if the company like introduces them to each other, and my memory was to avoid that.
It's interesting.
I have two questions. One is for Peter and one is for Megan. My question for Peter is that you were saying at the beginning of your presentation that people erroneously compare the so-called crack epidemic of the 80s and 90s to the present day opioid crisis, and I was wondering why you felt that was a false comparison, and if you could speak to that.
Yeah, so that was a bit of an off, but I was just referencing that there's been a debate, I think a very valid debate, about why was crack so demonized and these draconian laws and prison sentences.
And why are opioids
and why is it now something, it's a disease, you need to treat me to help people. I mean, obviously I don't think now cracking down on a new generation of addicts is going to help anything, right? But it does show clear racial disparities.
Yeah.
And I'm very sympathetic to that critique of the establishment response or state responses to epidemics.
Okay.
I mean,
So I totally misunderstood what you said. I apologize.
No, I was just basically saying that there's a valid point to be made.
Yeah, okay. And then my question for Megan is, first of all, thank you guys for your papers. They were all fantastic and really fascinating. I'm wondering if anything has changed since you presented your results to these service providing organizations. And then I'm also wondering, you said you chose your sample through a snowball effect. I was wondering if you could explain that. I'm a historian, not a sociologist, so I'm confused as to how a sample of 12 might be representative of a larger population.
Okay, so what has changed that I've seen so far is that kind of, I presented at one meeting and we have a meeting every 2 months. At the next meeting, we decided that we were going to do a hands-on, community-wide event where we invited residents to come to talk to us about youth violence and problems that were going on in the community, because that was one thing that was really bad, like in the housing projects, like teenagers were just getting shot left and right. So that's one, like the first thing that we were like, we need to address this. What can we do? Well, we need to talk to residents. So that was great. I was actually baffled that they moved that fast. They're like, okay, let's listen to them. So that's great. And what was your second? Oh, how is, so snowball sampling. Let's say you express interest to me, you come to me and say, I would like to be interviewed for your project. And I say, okay. And then at the end of the interview, now that we have a rapport and we know a bit about each other, I ask you, do you know anyone that might be interested in talking to me either for this project or about this project? And then you might give me their contact information and say, let me contact them to make sure it's okay that I give you their information, and then we move forward. And that's how snowball sampling works. And it is not representative.
Okay.
But it does tend to show you what the network looks like, or what a specific like tree branch of a social network might believe, or how they act or behave or something like that.
Do you get a sense of what the various leanings were of your sample of 12? Like, were they more involved in the community than, say, other people might be that you could have talked to?
I think so, and I think that might actually be why they were so interested in talking to me. But I did have a lot of other people that learned about my project later than like the cutoff date for my interviews, and they probably learned later about it because they weren't so involved in the community. And one of my goals, hopefully, would be to open that up for it to be more representative of the community and to see what comes of it.
Awesome, thank you.
I have a question for Tim, and knowing Tim for many years. And when I saw you sort of emphasize Dave, and I felt in many ways you were like Dave, okay? And your studies like Dave. You're trying to work out whether that work experience was real, imagined, or nostalgic. And at the same time, the whole idea is of modernity. So part of your work is really a struggle between generally nostalgia, or what might be called nostalgia, what people were really feeling, and what now happens in terms of modernity and the rolling changes of work and how that's all changing all of us, especially within the context of part of the earlier discussions of there is no concrete place. People don't live in the same places nearby the factory systems, and the role of media in sort of shaping whatever those structural belief systems are. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that struggle between modernity and nostalgia that's really often reflected in your work. Yeah, I want that in 5 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, it's for a longer conversation perhaps, but yeah, and this is where at the beginning of my career I got accused of being nostalgic because I was finding value in working class work and culture. And it's been really, the person who said it to me meant it to be critical and not constructive. and it has been incredibly constructive because it gets you to think about what nostalgia is, and nostalgia always tells you more about the present than it does about the past. But it's an exploration, it's a way of thinking through, reflecting on what that past was. What was it about that past that Dave, in that case, valued, the kind of things that he got from it, but also then a critical re-evaluation. Well, was that, not that he was using those phrases, but was that just false consciousness? Was it just something was I just stuck in the groove? Was I just stuck in the rut? But what I find fascinating about that interview across the piece was he's going, that stuff I was telling my kids, that was out of date. That was probably out of date when I was, mid-career. I mean, what I didn't tell you is that he'd gone through 4 redundancy rounds where he'd had to reapply for his job. And I said to him, are you going to miss it? Because he was, by this time he knew he was on the way out. And he said, if you'd asked me that 5 years ago, I would have said yes, not now. The attachment I had is gone. I can't invest any more in being attached to my work. I'm done with it. I can't build myself up. I can't invest that. So, and that's playing in his mind about what his kids are going to do, what his boys are going to do, because he's saying, well, and he's genuinely perplexed as to what advice he could offer his kids. And it's, I suppose, for a father, that's a scary thing. What do we do? He doesn't know what to do, what's the best thing to advise his kids. And what he's reflecting, I think, is a sense of, all I can say is something that's contingent. It's not a kind of, this is a model to follow. Even if it's do as I did or don't do as I did. He can't, either one of those isn't really capturing any sort of meaningful advice. So, and I suppose if he's nostalgic, it is for the supposed certainty that he thought he was working in the long boom. When he would have started in the mid to late 60s. And that's gone. So, and the physical place where he worked has been completely levelled, and it's now something completely different. So.
Just to add on to that, I was really struck by the Brick story too, and a particular word. I think it was woman, right? The story about the brick said that she wanted that as like to keep the brick as like a totem of where we worked. She didn't say I worked, and so like I'd say there's a lot of nostalgia in that story, but specifically there's some nostalgia for I think the solidarity, right? The community, not just the job and the predictability or whatever, the security of it, but the other people. You might expect someone to say like where I work, where I put all those years in, but she said we.
And it's something, what always gets me about that is it's a tangible thing. She can't just rely on her memories. She wants something that's going to evoke and provoke a physical thing that's going to say, that's it, that's where we were, that's what we did. And I think when crude Marxists would say, work is alienating, what is it to take a souvenir of the place in which you suffered alienation? So that complicates it for me. And a crude Marxist would then say, well, that's false consciousness, isn't it? And I believe me, I've had that reaction to my work. So, yeah.
I think I will do my duty until you're officially out of time. But I'm also really enjoying the conversation, so I'm doing that reluctantly. You do go have dinner time now for 2 hours, so feel free to keep talking.
Thank you.
And thank you all very much for